All right, so I'm just going to start with introductions as people are coming in, so we can get us started since it's already 7:04. So I want to thank everybody for coming, including our panelists, and for watching Screenagers Under the Influence. We thankfully had a really good turnout this time around when we did the Screenagers, this option where you can watch from home. We had 300 slots and they were all filled, and actually people were emailing and asking for more. So I was really happy with the turnout of our screening this time around. So, I think this is, as we'll discuss today, an important film, and I just wanted to explain who I am. So I'm Karina Restrepo. I'm the prevention coordinator for Greenwich Together. And Greenwich Together, if you don't already know, I'm sure we have a lot of our coalition members on the call that have tuned in today, as well as some on our panel today. But Greenwich Together is our local prevention coalition. So we focus a lot on substance misuse prevention and mental health awareness and promotion in the community. And we most recently did a survey back in February and of last year. And what we did was we asked youth around substance use, mental health, and we also added some new questions around social media use. So we thought it was important that this film talked about the digital age and social media use and mental health all in one, and talked both from the youth perspective and the parent perspective. So we wanted to get together to give everybody an opportunity to debrief and talk about some of the important topics that were mentioned during the film. So before we get started, I just want to introduce our panelists today. So I'll start with Lindsay Taylor, who has been our Greenwich Together superstar. She has done so much work for Greenwich Together. She is a senior at Sacred Heart. She is the co-chair of our Greenwich Together Youth Coalition, and she's been doing prevention work with the Greenwich Together Coalition for about 3 years now. And I'll move over to Dr. Maggie Young. Dr. Maggie Young is also a coalition member, and she has been working in the behavioral health field for over 25 years and is a chief recovery officer at Liberation Programs. Maggie is passionate about supporting youth and families as they navigate the often difficult steps of access to care. She maintains collaborative relationships with community partners and serves on a number of boards throughout the state. Maggie has oversight of liberation prevention and education programs, women and children, as well as permanent supportive housing. Then we'll move over to Maxwell Fetterman. He is an instructional paraeducator at Roxbury Elementary. Maxwell played soccer at Carnegie Mellon and now coaches soccer at West Hill High School. He has previously worked at the Boys and Girls Club and works at Long Ridge Camp in the summer. He enjoys teaching and coaching. And Dr. Alina is a bilingual school psychologist working for the Greenwich Public Schools. She had earned her doctorate degree from St. John's University in New York. For the past 10 years, she has been supporting schools with the implementation of social emotional learning initiatives, mindfulness, bullying prevention. Dr. Alina has conducted numerous parent and teacher workshops on issues related to mental health, parenting, resilience, and stress management. So thank you to our panelists for joining us today. So I just want to open up our conversation by going around the panel and just getting some key takeaways from the film, some things that you feel like the audience or people who watch this film should take away or remember from it. So we'll start with Dr. Alina.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be among so many wonderful people who do great things for our community. I think one of the things that stuck in my mind, and it's very important to bring to not only parents, but also the attention of all teenagers out there, is that regardless of how you look at addiction, whether it's drug addiction, whether it's media addiction, social media addiction, or drugs in themselves, there's the same kind of mechanisms, whether you play video games or you are getting high by using a substance or you're just on a device all day long. The same pathway in our brain is the one that is responsible for all of those addictions. So their addiction in no matter what angle you're taking them from. And I think it's important to keep in mind because the same substance will be released in our brain when we are getting high on pot, or we are playing a video game, or we're spending 5 hours on social media. So I think it's an important concept because although people may take it from a different angle, the process and chemical imbalance in our brain is identical.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Dr. Alina. We'll move to Dr. Maggie Young.
Thank you, Karina. Thanks for having me. And so ditto to everything that Dr. Elena said, right? I'm thinking as she's sharing, oh, that's what I was going to say. And so because of the fact that addiction is a brain disease and that the underdeveloped brain is hijacked at that moment when a person first actually uses anything is really what I thought was highlighted really well. And so social media and screening is no different than that. I thought the other piece that was really well done and very interesting for me was really looking at the trajectory of kind of social media and how it's so easy to actually look at this as a positive as opposed to a negative in comparison to the substance use piece of it, as opposed to the screening part of it. And as Dr. Elena said, you know, it's all hitting the same place. So the behavior having to do with like whether it's alcohol or vaping or nicotine, whatever it may be, it is all the same.
Thank you, Maggie. We'll move to Lindsay.
Yeah, I think adding on to what Dr. Young was saying, I think there's a reason why it's called Screenagers Under the Influence. I was really struck by specifically the role that media played in the various addictions and mental health crises depicted in the film. As Dr. Young mentioned, it seems like that there's a growing advertisement or depiction of drug use and substance use, or even something like video game use as positive or glorified. And I think that this film really addresses the psychology behind that, how that affects teens or normalizes this behavior. And I think one thing that was really nice to have a conversation about with some of the other teens that I was watching it with is how do we combat this perception? And I think that's a real big takeaway question, at least from the film.
Great, thank you, Lindsay. And Max. Oh, Max, you're muted.
Thank you. I thought the film does a really good job of showing how the public perception that a lot of the companies that are selling these things put out is very different from the reality for many people. And, you know, it's true with video games and gambling as much as it is for other substances, where the people that are generating the most profit sometimes don't have the life that you see in the advertisements. And I think it's really important to realize that even though for some people these can be things that are used moderately and in a healthy manner, these are also things that are dangerous and that can very quickly take you down a path of hijacking your decision making, like someone said earlier. And I think it's good that there's now more and more awareness about how this is happening, and that in fact this is happening, and that this is a real concern that you should be aware of if you have someone with a brain that's developing today.
Great, thank you, Max. All right, so, you know, we want this to be really a discussion that is for the audience. So I do have some questions prepared that our youth came up with and are ready to ask. But I also, at this point, would like to open it up to our audience to also be able to chime in and ask questions. There should be a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can type in questions. There is also an option you can request to be promoted to a panelist if you would like to come on screen and discuss with us as well. So either of those two options, you're welcome to do so at this point. So, and we do have somebody monitoring the chat, so feel free to interrupt if there is any questions as they come in. So as we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, I'll start with one of our questions that our youth came up with, which is, at what point does substance use cross the line from normal teenage behavior into problematic behavior? And we'll leave it, you know, whoever wants to chime in, I won't call on you.
Okay, so I'll chime in with that. You know, the normal teen behavior and substance use, you know, it crosses the line. Number one is, if the teen is a teen, it is already crossed the line because of the fact that it's illegal. And the underdeveloped brain, once that happens, then it already is impacting because of the fact that the brain is not developing as the person continues to go. So I think that the thing that becomes a bit of a risk is the fact of how long it takes to identify the behavior change. So if I'm a parent who's actually, you know, if I'm a parent and myself and my child's dad, like, you know, we're both working and my child is spending a lot of time alone, and there's a lot of screen time, and there's a lot of, actually in that, it's also the ability to maybe just you know, have access by maybe an older sibling or someone else for, you know, getting, you know, whatever it is, whatever the substance is. So I don't see the behavior. So it could be at any of those stages of the use, the dependence, the abuse, the addiction. It could be at any point. But if I'm not there and I'm not watching what is happening, then it becomes even riskier because of the fact that I'm not able to see it.
Thanks, Maggie. Any other comments on that?
I just wanted to add to that. I liked how Dr. Young spoke about the underdeveloped brain. And, you know, for our audience, I think it would be nice to just think about the knowledge we have about the brain. And one of the most wonderful things is that our brain is continually developing, right? And we know based on science that it takes up to maybe mid to now end of our 20s for our brain to be fully developed. The other interesting fact is that in adolescence, the centers that fire the most in an adolescent brain is the center of emotion, and within our limbic system, where that amygdala part of it resides. That is where we have those neurons firing the most, which means in translation, basically, that our teenagers are thinking with their emotional side of their brain, not with their prefrontal cortex, which is more where the decision-making happens, where the rational decision-making happens, right? So we see a lot of risky behaviors. We see a lot of the conception of, it is not me, it's not going to get me. I know when to stop. I know how to make decisions so it doesn't affect me. But I think it's a very slippery line between what you would consider safe and what it's not safe. And as Dr. Young put it, it's already crossing a line when you're consuming a substance that it's illegal, right? And I think it's a very dangerous thing, because sometimes we hear parents, well, you know, they're teenagers, it's normal that they try things. And I want to be very cautious about that, because it's not really typical and normal to start to use, you know, all the range of things that are out there. And typically people expect, oh, you know, we're talking about smoking and you know, alcohol. And the truth is, once an addiction starts, it brings another addiction and another addiction, because the brain is looking for more excitement, for more dopamine release type of substances that you will not achieve with one small little dose. So it's going to get out of control very, very quickly. And I think it's a very dangerous slope, where in lack of supervision, as Dr. Young mentioned, you might be finding yourself at a point where it's already very late in the process, and there's a lot of effort into getting those youths to get back to where they were, as very nicely depicted in the film as well.
Right. Thank you so much for that. Anybody else?
I would just add that I think the question is very revealing in itself, that like, at what point does alcohol use or substance use cross from normal to abnormal? Because that suggests that there is a sense of like normalcy to using substances in the first place. And as Dr. Young pointed out, really the first use is kind of crossing the line. And I think one thing that really stuck with me about the Screenagers film is specifically the classification of binge drinking and partying associated with drinking, because I think in a lot of teen-oriented media, there are a lot of parties, there are a lot of displays of drinking alcohol that would be considered binge drinking, that result in vomiting or other symptoms. So that's clarified as normal, because that's what the media is telling us is typical teen behavior. But in reality, I don't know many people who would go out and drink, like for women it would be 4 drinks in a few hours. I don't know many people who would do that. So I think it kind of, by normalizing the extreme, you're also allowing for an addiction to grow, because it seems normal until the point when you realize this is really out of control.
Thank you, Lindsay. And Max, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that the media narrative, and certainly the narrative, I grew up in Manhattan, and I know when I was growing up, underage drinking was very, very common. And it was almost to the point of my parents didn't even kind of consider telling me not to drink, like even as a teenager. I mean, it was accepted. And today I don't drink, and I'm very happy to live a life where I don't drink. But I think that if you're a parent and you have a kid that's a teenager, the legal age is 21, and I would just argue at least that have a conversation with your child and just see what their beliefs are, see what the beliefs are of their friends, because going back to being a teenager and really feeling your emotions very strongly, a lot of this stuff is very social, and social media and a lot of our media really does promote drinking and smoking, and in a lot of ways it is seen as a cool thing to do. And I think that can contribute to the problem, and the healthiest way to address that is just to have a conversation, and then maybe just offer that as a question of, well, do you think that you could have fun without drinking? Or, I mean, what are the beliefs behind the emotions that might lead to that behavior? Something along those lines, maybe.
Thanks, Max. I think that leads, a little bit to a follow-up question, which I think a lot of parents might feel after watching this film is a little bit overwhelmed. There's a lot of information that comes out, and, hearing some of these stories, personal stories of both parents and youth, can feel a little bit overwhelming. So, I think from everybody's standpoint on the panel, what advice would you give to parents who are feeling like, okay, now I have all this information, and Max just spoke a little bit about, some tips, but what advice would you give to a parent who, either has a child, a teenage child that maybe isn't engaging in substance use, or maybe gaming, or, but or maybe one that is. So on both spectrums, you know, one that they already are having some concerns and one that, you know, maybe they're not having some concerns, but how do they have those conversations with their child?
So I'll start again. You know, I think that the foundation for all of this really has to be when we look at and whether the child has difficulty or does not have difficulty, it really is the relationship. So it's the relationship, because as much as youth don't want their parents to see that they're paying attention to what they say, or they're following the guidelines that they want them to follow, or that they're really listening, they really, you can often ask someone who is actually an adult or even a friend in that group, and kids will reference what it is that their parents tell them or how they're, you know, socializing them. So I think for the parent, it is really important, first of all, for that parent to be very comfortable in their own beliefs about everything, right? Be clear about where they stand. Open communication around it, right? And then making sure that they are, Max mentioned about kind of like talking to the kid. So if it's a kid who actually is already kind of struggling with something, what is the gain? What are they gaining from that? So somehow they need to feel like that there's still open communication. They can talk to their parent, their caregiver about what is happening, because somewhere they're out looking for something that they feeling somehow they're not getting from wherever they feel like that they should be getting it. So they're looking for something. So talking to them about that. The other thing is that non-judgmental is like a word that really is like $1 million word. It is so important to be able to actually have a conversation where a person feels heard and is not being judged or is not being attacked by, and there's not the assumption that you're doing more than what you're doing or less of what you're doing. But education, the relationship, making sure that that parent, the caregiver, that they're clear about where they stand, and then all that open communication, plus the fact of like the risk and the information that the parent needs to know that as well for themselves.
Great, thank you, Maggie.
I can go next if that's okay. I mean, there's so many thoughts that, you know, I was thinking of. So if I had to choose the best advice, maybe it's, you know, going along with what Dr. Young said, always know your child, and keep that communication. Communication is so key. In fact, you know, when is it, when it's the time to talk, and I always say to parents, there's no great time to talk. Always talk to the kids, teach them to talk about things and have communication when they're 2, when they're 3, when you take them from daycare. Waiting until they're teenagers to have that communication, it's a bit too late. So getting into the habit of talking to your kids and talk often. Kids love to talk in the car, by the way, and the reason being is that you're driving, you're not facing them, so they're more comfortable talking to you. So use that time wisely as you're driving places. That way they don't feel confronted. I love what Dr. Young said about, you know, having boundaries. It is puzzling how sometimes there's an image in our society that we created that we have to be friends with our children. In fact, we don't. And in fact, it is not even suggested to be healthy to have the relationship. And I know what parents mean when they mean like, I want to be friends with my child. What they really are saying is, I want my child to feel comfortable, ask for advice, and come to me first when they have a question. In no way, shape, or form we can be friends, because friends means that you have the compromise of saying, you know, bye, see ya, I don't want to be friends anymore. We don't have that with our children, right? Like it or not, it's a relationship. It's not the same kind of relationship, nor should it be, right? As parents, I think it's very healthy to have expectations, to put some boundaries about where it is crossing the line, because some things can be irreversible. And so I think communicate. Keep in mind that forming a routine, setting expectations, and predictable expectations is the healthiest way of keeping children and building resilience around them, and making sure that they feel safe, but at the same time that they know you're doing this in their best interest. You can't compromise on some things. Some things are non-negotiable. You can negotiate very many things in a relationship with a child, but you may not be able to negotiate those things when it comes to addiction, risky behaviors that could be absolutely irreversible.
Thank you, Dr. Alina. Lindsay?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of examples of parents specifically in the film that I think really demonstrated what Dr. Alina and Dr. Young were saying, specifically around setting boundaries. Like, for example, there was one mother who made sure that her kids wouldn't drink inside the house because there's a common myth that if you're drinking within the house, then it's safer or it's at least safe. But in that sense, it promotes binge drinking. And it also promotes like house parties or drinking as a social activity, inviting kids over to drink. And I think by simply setting boundaries, like one of our house rules is that no kids drink alcohol here. That means you can't invite your friends over to drink. Something as simple as that makes your boundaries known. And makes your stance clear. But I think it's also really critical as well to create a message of support as well. One key point that I heard a lot of kids saying was supportive from their parents was when they heard them echo that we're here for you, we'll always pick you up, whatever you need, because I think that really initiates this kind of open communication line of support in case there's ever trouble, whether you've had one drink or whether you are just need to get out of a situation where you're surrounded by triggers. I think just implementing a network of support with boundaries is the most critical thing.
Thank you, Lindsay. And Max, I want to go to you, but I wanted to change up the question a little bit to ask it to you. And just, you know, I think Max has a special role on the panel, and I was hoping maybe you can talk a little bit about your personal experience and maybe what you feel like would have worked for you at that time.
Yeah, I'll share, you know, my biggest addiction was with video games. And so I would play video games for a long periods of time, very regularly, basically from a very young age. And only kind of in my 20s have I figured out kind of how to curtail this and work on this. And I mean, you know, it's something that is kind of a daily part of how I think now because of all of this use throughout my whole life. And I actually don't think that's uncommon today. I think that most adults today have in the back of their mind or in the forefront of their minds thoughts about like, well, when am I going to watch TV? When am I going to check Instagram? When am I going to do this? You know, to a certain degree, I don't think that I'm unique in having this problem, but I think that I'm unique in that when it comes to video games specifically, I played a lot starting at the age of like 7 in the car. It would be like a Game Boy and I would just be, you know, up all night. And I mean, even before that, maybe it was like reading, and it was, you know, I would just read for hours and hours on end. And not that reading is bad, but it's like anything, if you're doing it when you're supposed to be sleeping and you're doing it for hours at a time and getting totally lost in it, is just really not beneficial in terms of your development. And I think when I look at my family and I look at how I am now as a 28-year-old, I think what would have helped me the most as a parent would have been to just have consistent role models, or at least a single consistent role model at home. And I think that there's a lot of discussion around boundaries and around things like that. And I think that that's really important. And I also think that it's important to be consistent. I think that humans as a people, adults, kids, anybody, we don't learn really through rote memorization. I mean, we might like spit that out to you, but we really learn through example. And so if I'm at home and I have a parent who's telling me, well, shut off the video game, go do homework. You know, for one thing, it doesn't help that most of our homework is digital, that most of our homework is online, that your student, that your child is going to have to be on a laptop, on a computer for a certain period of time. That's not ideal. And I think the first step as a parent would be to figure out a way to either limit that or do that in a more communal way where, you know, you have a certain amount of time on the computer and it's for your work, and you as a parent are also working during this time. I would say what didn't work for me as someone who continued to play video games his whole life was having a parent who would say, you know, get off the computer, stop doing your work, and then would go and watch TV all night. You know, and I think you could apply that to any addiction. I think if you're a parent and you're going to tell your kid not to drink, and then you're going to have 4 or 5 drinks over the course of the night, that might not be an effective strategy in terms of, you know, I think that if you're going to, if you really want to affect change in your child, you need to be that role model because they are looking up to you. They are seeing how you are behaving, and subconsciously they want to copy that behavior. And so, you know, I think it's hard today when you have parents that maybe aren't around as much, you know, and if you're that parent that can't be there super often, I think that I can definitely understand that it's hard to come home maybe after a long day of work and then have this extra job of now I have to be the role model of now, you know, in order to be there for my child, I have to then not drink or not watch TV or whatever it is. But the reality is, I think from my personal experience is that if I have a parent that's going to come home and tell me to turn something off, but then go and do it themselves, I'm not going to hear the words, turn it off. I'm going to see the action of, you know, the person that I'm looking up to, their ritual, their behavior is, I'm going to do this activity. And so I think in addition to everything else, that consistency and that power of example and like house rules, you know, I think that those are important. And I think maybe you don't need to, as an adult, follow the exact same rule, but something in the spirit of the rule, you know, that if you really don't want to have a teenager that's drinking, you know, and you don't want them having parties at your house, then maybe as an adult, at least while your kid is dealing with a lot of mixed messaging, you know, maybe try to have parties when they're not around, you know, because if you're exposing them to a lot of fun parties, they're subconsciously creating this connection, I think, you know, and I don't know the science of all this, but I'm just speaking from my own experience of when my parents told me don't do something and then proceeded to go on and spend a lot of time watching TV in their free time or doing whatever they wanted, I felt like they had no credibility because they were doing something other than what they were telling me to do. And so then I looked to other sources, and all those other sources said, like, play video games all the time. And that's what I did. So, you know, if I'm going to speak from personal experience, I think that that's the message that I would want to give most of parents is, you know, really, really communicate with your kids and then have a discussion about what do you think is fair, and, you know, and how can you be that role model? Because again, if you're not their friend, you're the example. And I guess I'll share one more thing that I think is just fascinating about how we learn. But I had someone recently tell me that as a parent, they were in front of their young kid and they told them, tell the person on the phone I'm not here. And then they never did that again because they realized that having their child lie to someone else, they were teaching their child to lie. And I think that with a lot of addiction, we need, you know, as a culture, as a, you know, as role models, to realize that people are looking at what we do. So if I have a younger sister and I'm going to tell her don't drink, but then I'm going to go out and have a party at my parents' house and have a bunch of people over and we're all binge drinking, you know, I'm not being a good role model in that situation as an older brother. And, you know, as a parent, I think that, again, the message that your kid receives, they'll receive the verbal message, but they're also going to receive the message of how they interpret your actions and your behavior. And that sometimes can be more impactful to them. So that's what I'll say.
Thank you, Max, and thank you for sharing. All right, and just a reminder, please feel free to put any questions in the chat as we're speaking. It's open to audience questions as well. So another question from our youth was, how can we ensure that those struggling with addiction feel supported and not shamed?
I can go first if that's okay. And I really love how you put things so nicely in perspective, Max, because I think it's very powerful what you said about modeling, and it connects to the next question about how to encourage them to not be ashamed. And I think it goes back to what Max was saying of being role models. And by doing that, you're not only modeling good behavior, but you should also feel free to show that you are vulnerable, and don't be afraid to show that as parents, we're not perfect, because we're not, right? So in other words, if you have a moment when you're frustrated, when you're mad, when you're angry, use that as a teaching opportunity to say, look, I'm angry too, I'm frustrating, but you know what? Here's what I want to do in this moment. Maybe I want to go and, tell this person all that I feel without even thinking twice about it. But I know that it may not be the best option in this moment because I'm not in the best mindset to do a good conversation, to have a good conversation. So I'm going to take a moment for myself right now. I'm going to cool down, and I'm going to use my strategies to calm down and then go to the next step, right? So modeling not only good behavior, but how to cope and how to act in situations where we mess up, because we are human beings. We are not perfect. And by showing your child that you are vulnerable too, that yes, you make mistakes, and the most important part is to fix them, and to show that you are able to allow yourself to be vulnerable, your child then it's not going to feel like they need to be perfect. And if I'm not perfect, then I'm not going to be loved, or I fail my parents, I fail my teachers, right? So having an honest conversation about the fact that we are all kind of growing together. And yes, we may have more experience. Yes, maybe our brains are a little more developed. But yet, we're in this world together, making mistakes and learning from them and growing from them. So if you have an operating system like that, a conversation about, you made a mistake means that you're growing from it. How can we work together to grow from it? And what can we do differently next time? Then it's not going to be a fear of being embarrassed, because the fear of being embarrassed means I need to be perfect. You expect me to be here because you yourself might be, they look at us as something that, someone who might be perfect. And as a result of that, in contrast with what they see us, right, then they feel that they're not good enough. So I think it starts from there, to show that you are not only a model for good behaviors, but you're also a model for how to solve problems and cope.
That's great, Alina. Anybody else have any comments on that question?
I think one key insight that I have is, this was something that was also mentioned in the film, but it's so critical to distinguish between this problem is an issue, or this behavior is an issue, and I am an issue. Like, that's very critical language and messaging to distinguish, because I know a lot of shame stems from feeling like you're the issue, and that the behavior that's causing problems is a fundamental part of who you are. And I think one thing, specifically speaking from experience, that my parents have done for me that I've found really helpful in making me feel less anxious when I come to them with my problems, is they always talk to me with like a level tone, which is not always possible or feasible, but in general, they try to make sure that when they're speaking to me, even if something bad has happened, or if I've made a mistake, or if I'm in like a stressful situation, they always come at it from a perspective of how are we going to tackle this issue together. It's not them trying to fix you or fix your problems, but it's you and them trying to work together to solve the issue as a unit. And I think that creates stronger bonds of communication between a parent and a child. But it also very much clarifies that this is not a part of who you are, and this issue is not something to be ashamed of, but it's something that we can support as a family.
Great, thank you, Lindsay.
And I think here is where I think the word normalize can fit, right? So I think it's really important to normalize the struggle, whatever that's whatever that be, right? As much as possible, number one. And number two is to really be able to hear how that person views this struggle, because the assumption at this point is that there's some line of communication open, there's been something, so if this person, if I know that they're struggling, I have some sense of a relationship with them. So I want to make sure that, number one, that I nurture that relationship by listening and hearing, again, what is it that they are gaining? What is the win for them in this behavior? What is the win? What do they feel like they're gaining from that? And then how can I be of help? What would you like for me to do? Is there anything you would like for me to do? And in addition to that, know where resources are. So if there is something where they say, you know what, I really would like to, I don't know, I'd like to have maybe a few days away and go into, treatment or whatever that may be, whatever that looks like that they say they'd like, know where to find that and then offer to be there with them to get them to that place for a warm handoff. And to be able to do that, because I think that as Dr. Elena said, and Lindsay mentioned it too, we're not our mistakes, but when a person gets into that dark place, it almost feels like that there's there's the mistake is the person as opposed to the action. And the other thing that I really like that was shared is the fact that when we normalize, it really is, there's a place for disclosure of whether it's self-disclosure around an experience I've had with a friend, right? Third party always work with when you're talking to youth, right? I had a friend who at one point they did this, or yesterday at work, I had such an incident that I this and I that. And so to Dr. Elena's point around the fact that, no, this is not, you're not seeing me as this perfect person. And the message then is able to be softer, but at the same time, possibly received a little better.
Great, thank you, Maggie. Max, anything you want to add to that?
No, I thought what everyone said was good, and I think it just goes back to, I really liked what Maggie said, figure out what they're gaining. I think ultimately they're getting some benefit from that, and what is that benefit, and how can you as a problem solver figure out okay, well, I mean that's the most compassionate way to start that conversation is well, so what is this benefit and why do you feel like you need this thing, but I don't know that even necessarily phrasing it the way, like, why do you feel you need this, like that could maybe be aggressive. I'm not a doctor, I don't know how you have this conversation, but I think just the idea of getting to the root of why this is the solution, I think that's the right direction.
Right. All right, thank you, Max. All right, so I think we're gonna have time for one more question. So our youth last night when we were watching the Screenagers video, one thing that they pointed out was in the video, they talked about how abstinence, just talking about abstinence is not the answer. And that prevention looks different depending on at what age group you're looking at, and then it looks different when you're getting to 11th and 12th grade and talking to high schoolers that might already be using substances. So one of the questions that they had was, how do we help youth stay safe who we know are experimenting with substance use?
So again, I think that this is an area of knowing what resources are, knowing where there is, safe place, also education on the risk associated with the use, right? And it really has to be really based from the relationship with that friend. So if that friend is gonna ride with me, I don't know, across town, and that's an opportunity to really talk about, they give me the amount of information that they give me, and I need to use that to be able to assist. But I think, again, it has to start with exactly what it is that is happening, that is being told to me, what it is that they feel like that they want to do. But also, I think if we could really, we want to go concrete and just say, say, for example, we know that we're in the midst of the fentanyl epidemic. Ask if they have Narcan, right? Do you have Narcan? Do you know this lady trained me and gave me Narcan, and it's free and you can get it from here? So that's one of the areas that it really, you could say asking for that, because we know so many things are being laced with that. I had a student talk to me, and it talked about it in the film as well. The young lady talked about, she before she started to vape, and with all of the screening, that she didn't have anxiety. She got it after, right? And so the thing is that when it comes down to anything, any substance that someone else have, it goes back to the parent relationship. So if I know where my caregiver stands, my parent stands, right? And I trust them that they won't give me anything that will harm me. If it's not your parent or your caregiver and someone is giving something, I think that message around the fact of don't accept anything from anyone who is not your parent or your caregiver, of looking at that and having as much information as you possibly can. And I think the other thing is, like, looking at first responders, right? We know that, kids go out and they end up and they're in a blackout and things of that sort. Be willing to always call 911 and say, listen, there's someone who appears to need some help here.
Thank you, Maggie. Anybody else want to add to that?
I really like the idea of informing. I think that data really speaks louder than just opinions. Even in the film, I like the idea of, going back to the numbers and sharing the fact there's some myths and false beliefs out there that sometimes are being shared, and more and more of those myths become almost to a teenager like it's facts, science, right? Oh, you can't get pot can form an addiction. How many times you hear that, but going back to a source of information that they would believe and say, okay, let's see what the actual data is showing. Let's talk about, sources of information that you may and I think it's not only in the context of the, addiction, but it's in general getting children from a very young age to know how to be good consumers of information, because oftentimes they rely on peers to find facts from. I think it starts from, conversations that parents are uncomfortable to have, and then they rely on someone because they want those answers. So really being the provider of information for your child from an early age, and getting them to train them to know how to filter information, and talking about numbers. In the film, they were talking about the belief that if you let adolescents consume alcohol at before they get to college, then they will not be the ones who will be binge drinking in college, where the reality is different. And so even having that kind of fact as a discussion, right? Not in a threatful or controlling kind of way, but mostly of, hey, by the way, here's a good information, a source of information, a believable one, right? What does it mean that it's a believable source of information? You know, looking at a source that could be in a journal, in a published article, something that you would take as a believable source of information. This is what they say. So let's talk more about what are the risks here, what are the benefits, what you're hearing, so at least you're informed and you know that at the end it's going to be their decision. And unfortunately, as parents, we have to have a little faith that all those seeds that we planted earlier in the years are going to bloom and allow them to make the decision. But in the end, it's going to be still their decision, because we're not going to be able to be with them 24/7. You can only hope and take that leap of faith that all those things and the nurturing and the seeding that you've done is going to bloom in the right time at the right place.
To add on to what Dr. Alina was saying, I think as well, that really making sure you know where you get your information is critical, because one thing that we were struck by in the film is the kind of advertising campaign, specifically of vapes directed towards teens, and how that almost becomes like a fact, like the lifestyle associated with vapes becomes a sort of myth that gets perpetuated by the internet. And I think promoting critical thinking skills from a very young age, in order to really emphasize the fact that you're not forcing your opinion on the kids, but you're giving them the real information for them to wrestle with and grapple with themselves, is, I think, really necessary for them to make the right decisions when they're dealing or coping with substance use. Because it's one thing to kind of force your opinion on someone and say, don't drink because I said so. And it's another thing to say, hey, look, here are the articles. This is how to be safe when drinking. But really, we see an increased correspondence of when you drink younger, you tend to binge drink more, against the facts. And really introducing that in all characteristics of substance use, I think, is necessary for really targeting the critical thinking skills that are necessary to keep our kids safe.
Thank you, Lindsay. All right, any final comments from our panel? Anything, or from the audience? Any final questions, last minute questions?
So I would like to just say that I think it's really important for parents to know, number one, that no two kids are the same, right? So whatever it is, just know your kid enough to be able to really to support them and to plant the seed to do that. And not knowing something does not equal being a bad parent. Get the information that's available.
Thank you, Maggie.
Just to add on that, I would say, you know, besides knowing your child very well, look for any patterns of sudden change. Any change in your child's normal routine is significant of something, is an indication of something, right? I tell parents sometimes, if your child doesn't do their homework, all of a suddenly they start doing it, don't question it, be happy, celebrate. But any deviation from a typical you know, routine, any kind of thing that you see different, where they change their mood, they change the peers that they hang out with, they change how they like to do things and so forth, question it and look into it in a little bit more. Kids are very predictable. They like routine, they like predictability. So looking into what is causing the change, and if it's a good change, then celebrate. But if it's not, most of the time, it's going to be an indication of, hey, there's something going on here and maybe we're not going in the right direction. So be on the watch for any sudden change, keep an open communication, and also, you know, recognize that it does take a village. So it may be not something what Dr. Young said, maybe it's not that you have the answer, but we have so many community members and so many organizations, even within our town, who are you know, a call away from helping, right? So reach out as soon as you see something that concerns you. Everybody's here to help, and two minds always find a better solution than one. So know that you're not alone in this, and that we're in it together, and you know, our efforts can you know, get to better results.
Thank you, Alina. Lindsay or Max, any final closing comments? All right, well, I want to thank our panelists for spending their evening with us and having such an enriching conversation. I think that this is just the beginning of this conversation. This movie, I think, really sparks many different things, and we probably could sit here all night and talk about different topics that came up during the movie. So I hope that this is the start of a conversation, and that everybody who watched the film continues to have these conversations with youth, with their families, and in the community. So I hope that the audience as well takes that with them, and I want to thank the audience for also spending their evening with us. So thank you so much, and this is the end of our webinar.
Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone.